Carlos Curbelo. Carlos was in Congress for about 6 years, and he has his own company which now focuses in part on the climate response. So he's the perfect person. Not only that, but when he was in Congress, he proposed some of the initial legislation on carbon trading. So he is an expert in it. He's a great guy. I've had the chance to be on stage with him one other time, and I just thought he was so clear and so dedicated to what he does. And as far as I'm concerned, we need more people like Carlos in our government because he is the new generation. He understands the problem, and he has not just the federal view, but he has the big city view. And we don't have very many people that have that. So Carlos is going to give a talk. It's going to be from his heart, which he always does. And then he and I are going to sit down, and I'm going to ask him some questions. And he doesn't even know what they are. So let's see what happens. Without further ado, Carlos. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob. And I should have disclosed to Bob when he invited me for this opportunity that I'm retired from speeches, especially keynote speeches. Now that I'm no longer in public office, I just like to talk to people the way normal people do. So I'm going to share some thoughts with you. Then Bob and I are going to have a quick conversation between ourselves up here, and then we want to get all of you involved so you can ask your questions and share your thoughts and ideas. The topic, I think the disclosed topic, is Miami and what Miami's doing about the climate challenge, and we're certainly going to get to that, but I want to give you more context and a broader perspective. So I ran for office in 2014 for Congress for the first time. Before that, I was blessed to serve on the school board, which sounds like a difficult experience, but was actually quite rewarding for me in Miami-Dade County. Congress was more difficult and unpleasant than dealing with angry parents, believe it or not. But I get to Congress. I had not really run on environmental policy. I cared about the environment. I think most of us who grow up in the state of Florida grow up with a pretty healthy environmental conscience, and growing up in Miami, you're between the ocean and the Everglades, so you kind of grow up with nature all around you and you have that appreciation for it. But frankly, it wasn't an issue of passion for me. I cared about immigration. I really wanted to try to solve that, and well, here we are, still no solution. I cared about tax policy, which we did get to pass the last comprehensive reform of the tax system in our country. I cared about foreign policy. So those were the issues that I kind of ran on. But I get to Congress, and in early 2015, I have a meeting with scientists from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And they show me the projections for my district in terms of sea level rise and what would happen if we continued polluting the atmosphere at current levels. And after they left, I looked around at my team and said, look, I know this isn't one of our big issues, but I don't think we have a choice. I represent the Florida Keys, you know. So we got to work. We had 247 House Republicans at the time. Kevin McCarthy would sure like to have that margin these days. He only has 222 or 3. And started asking around to see who knew about this issue, cared about it, was willing to work with me on it. And I found maybe a handful of Republicans who cared about the issue. And the big challenge with Republicans was not denialism. That gets a lot of attention. Every once in a while someone comes out and says, oh, all that climate science is a joke, it's a hoax, it's not true, it's liberal propaganda. That's very rare. But of course those people you get on TV all the time. The big challenge with Republicans and this issue was apathy. They just didn't care. They weren't interested in it. They didn't think it was important for them, for their districts. So we realized that we had this climate pollution challenge compounded by a political challenge, a political problem, which is that one party was just totally disinterested in an issue. So we started the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, the first ever organization inside the Congress dedicated to addressing climate change in a bipartisan manner. Democrats had always had their caucus to deal with this, but Republicans were never involved. And that caucus grew, and it ended up having 90 members at its peak, 45 Republicans, 45 Democrats, and it actually organized to block legislative action on the House floor. And this was historic, because prior to that, there wasn't even a dialogue, a conversation, any kind of bipartisan activity on climate pollution. Of course, decades ago, environmental issues were not that controversial, and Richard Nixon signed the EPA into existence. But in the modern era, there had been no conversation, no efforts whatsoever. And since then, and this will give you a little hope, because I think you got a lot of bad news earlier today, but in terms of policy, which matters deeply, deeply to address this challenge. This is a challenge that, of course, innovation and private investment and markets can contribute to and can help solve. But you need the government. You need public investment. You need policy alignment. And in that sense, we have made great progress. You're going to hear about the Inflation Reduction Act, which I always say the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, because it really had nothing to do with inflation. It actually had a lot to do with climate policy. And that's the real value in that legislation. Prior to that bill, which was passed only with Democratic support, because they used a reconciliation process, otherwise some Republicans would have voted for the climate provisions of that bill. But prior to that, every single climate policy victory in Congress was achieved with bipartisan support. The infrastructure bill had significant climate provisions, major investments in clean energy. Before that, the American Energy Act, or Murkowski-Manchin, also a bipartisan piece of legislation. Senators, Republicans and Democrats worked together to phase out hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, which are extremely potent greenhouse gases, more potent than carbon dioxide. So the progress in terms of policy and politics on this issue over the last 5, 6, 7 years has been extraordinary, and that matters. And of course, no one writes or talks about this because we have all this other drama going on in our country, right? With our Capitol being attacked and controversies about the legitimacy of elections, so no one has time to write about the progress and the cooperation that is happening in this policy space. And the reason this matters is because Miami and really the whole state of Florida, but especially the further south you go on the peninsula, the more exposed you are to sea level rise, because Florida's kind of a slope, which is why the water from the Everglades drifts south into Florida Bay. So in Miami and the Keys, we're right there at sea level. And maybe I'll tell you a funny story about the former president in a conversation I had with him. If we have time at the end, Bob will remind me. But we are so exposed, and a city like Miami, a county like Miami-Dade cannot solve this challenge on their own. You need support from the federal government. You need support from the state government. And that's why I give you this broader context of where we are on climate policy in this country. And that's why, while I was in Congress and still today in the private sector, a lot of my time is dedicated to building that bipartisan coalition that this issue needs. Not just to make sure we get solutions, but also to make sure we don't get crazy solutions, okay? Because the left is obviously deeply engaged in this issue, but some of their solutions are not really the best ones, and they might be good for the environment, but they might crush the economy and hurt people and make people lose jobs and displace people in other ways. So bipartisan engagement and participation on this issue is critical. Also because you need stable policy, predictable policy. For companies to make investments, you can't have policy changing every 2 or 4 years. And what happens when the two parties work together and make policy, those policies tend to be more durable. They have more standing power as opposed to policies that are passed by a single party, which, then when the other party takes over, those policies tend to be susceptible. So Miami has done a lot. And before the federal government and state governments actually stepped in, because the federal government is investing now to help coastal communities become more resilient. The state of Florida, to Governor DeSantis' credit, is making major investments in coastal infrastructure. DeSantis, as soon as he came into office, appointed a chief resilience officer who oversees this whole program. And he also appointed, interestingly, a chief science officer, because there was so much debate about the science that he wanted someone to kind of set the record straight. So on the adaptation half of the climate equation, I think Florida's doing wonderful things, and I think DeSantis gets high marks. On the mitigation half, there's very little happening, and that's not good. That's where we have to continue working to build some consensus. But even before all of this, cities like Miami, Miami Beach, the Florida Keys, Monroe County started making their own investments. The most they could, right? These weren't game-changing investments, but in 2017, City of Miami taxpayers voted to tax themselves $200 million so that they could invest in coastal infrastructure and deal with flooding. That means road elevation, sophisticated pump systems, new seawalls. That's all important. Florida Keys, they've done the same. A lot of road elevations there. The city of Miami Beach made a massive investment, and Miami Beach has a lot of resources because it's a fairly wealthy city that gets a lot of tourism dollars. So they were able to invest, I think, close to $1 billion, if I'm correct, if I remember correctly, on these kinds of projects. So these local communities are doing what they can. I think, I'm blessed to have a little property here on Longboat Key. And Longboat Key, I understand, is also, I think I saw it in my tax bill, we're paying for some resilience investments and undergrounding power lines and making, Gulf of Mexico Drive, I guess, more elevated, and improving the floodage and drainage systems there. So this all matters. This all matters to our economy. And Florida is so exposed, right? We have, I don't know, Matt McAleer probably knows how many billions of dollars in coastal real estate that's exposed to all of this. And the investments are being made, but the truth is we have to do both things at the same time. We not only have to invest in infrastructure, but we have to find common ground on addressing the problem at its root. And it means that we have to reduce carbon pollution. And there are many ways of doing that. A lot of my friends on the left say, oh, we need to get rid of the oil and gas industries. I say, look, I'm not about keeping stuff in the ground. I'm about keeping bad stuff out of the air. Okay? I want to see carbon pollution reduced to zero, right? What we call net zero, or what some people prefer to say real zero, not just net zero. But I don't care how we get there. If we can figure out a way to burn natural gas without polluting, I mean, that's good enough for me. In the meantime, of course, we should continue investing in solar and wind and nuclear. I mean, for a long time, the American left tried to destroy the nuclear industry. It's like big goal in every state. Let's get rid of all these nuclear plants. Well, every time close a nuclear plant, get replaced by a nat gas plant, more pollution, more pollution. The left has come around on that. There's that opposition no longer exists, and now both parties are working together to invest in new nuclear, which is smaller modular nuclear that doesn't take as long to build, hopefully will be less expensive. But a lot of power companies stop building nuclear because it take too long, too expensive, and you get sued 100 times in the process. So that all has to change. But look, I'm hopeful. Florida is living a very special moment. This has become, during the pandemic, became the most attractive state in the country for many reasons. The only major challenge that I can see, and of course others will come, but for now, the only major challenge that I can see in our future is this issue of the environment, and specifically sea level rise. And when hurricanes come, are they stronger? Will they be more damaging? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that they will. And that's a big problem for us. So it's wonderful that you have all gathered, Bob, that you brought everyone together to talk about this issue, to think about it, and most importantly, in my view, to build consensus around solutions that are win-wins. There doesn't have to be any exclusivity between solving this challenge and having a healthy, prosperous economy. We do not have to punish ourselves. We have to get organized because we do have to lead the world. I'll tell you that. This issue is unique in that sense. If we solve it in our country, but the rest of the world doesn't, we've just bought a little bit of time. We need to lead. But if we're going to lead, if the United States is going to lead, we need to have a basic level of consensus in our country between the two major parties, which means among the American people. So anyway, I'm here today to have this conversation with you and hopefully to help us all get a little closer to that point. With that, I'll invite Bob back. We'll have a quick talk and then we'll talk to you.